So our next speaker will be Dr. Philip Williams, who is a teaching professor of China Studies in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at Montana State University. He is also Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University. Dr. Williams' research on East Asian culture has resulted in more than 10 books as author, co-author, editor, and co-editor, including Village Echoes, The Fiction of Wu Zuxiang, and The Thought Remolding Campaign of the Chinese Communist Party State. So please join me to welcome Dr. Williams.
So the topic I'm going to be discussing is the emergence and eventual disappearance of the Chinese community of Virginia City, Montana, just in our neighboring county to the west, Madison County. They're sort of a ghost community. And the rise and decline of Chinese residency in Virginia City took place from roughly the mid-1860s to around the third decade of the 20th century. Both of these former Chinese residents of Virginia City appear to have been people who were in the service trades after the placer gold mining that marked the beginning of major Chinese settling this area occurred. They're both in Virginia City. The major pull factor attracting Chinese immigrants to hilly Virginia City was the placer mining gold rush that began in 1863 with the discovery of gold in and around Madison County's Alder Creek. This small stream, also known as Alder Gulch, flows through a narrow valley where the town of Virginia City sprang up to house the miners and the various businesses that catered to them. We see a Chinese placer miner, a gold miner on the left-hand side of on this photo. Yet when mechanical mining dredges replaced placer gold mining in Virginia City in the 1890s, the dredge mining company hired only Euro-American workers and passed over Chinese workers. Among other factors responsible for the decline of Virginia City's Chinese community were anti-Chinese discriminatory U.S. congressional laws such as the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1982. The photo in the middle of the slide represents these exclusionary acts, particularly directed towards Asian migrants, especially Chinese. These laws singled out Asian immigrants in general, Chinese in particular, for discriminatory treatment in the U.S. These laws were not significantly reversed until more equitable and just U.S. immigration laws were passed, first under the Franklin Roosevelt administration with the Magnuson Act of 1943, and especially under the Lyndon Johnson administration with the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, part of the Great Society set of laws. Finally, the photo on the right-hand side is of a U.S. big city Chinatown, where many Chinese immigrants from relatively small towns like Virginia City moved in the latter part of the 19th century, first part of the 20th century, in order to gain more community support and better employment opportunities. According to the 1870 U.S. Census, fully 1/3 of Virginia City's population consisted of Chinese residents, who were mostly immigrants and sojourners from Guangdong province. And we're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 people out of a population of around 8,000 to 9,000. Most were groups of placer gold miners held together by Navy-place ties back in Guangdong, while some others branched off in jobs in the service industry, such as shopkeepers and launderers. The photo at the left is of Chinese placer gold miners in Alder Creek area of Virginia City. In contrast, the photo at the right is of modern-day tourists in Virginia City who typically notice no traces of the former territorial capital's once teeming Chinese community. They're on the little steam railway that kind of follows Alder Creek basically from Virginia City towards Nevada City. Chinese residents of Virginia City were virtually all gone by the 1930s. There was nobody left in Virginia City to push back against the local government's decision to tear down the once famous two-story Chinese temple in order to straighten out a curve in the highway going through the town. We'll see a slide of that Chinese temple later on. So we're kind of wondering, so how did this happen? So perhaps a look at the past Chinese migration patterns worldwide might help to explain it. So the mid to late 19th century influx of Chinese sojourners and immigrants to the West, it was quite complex. After China's Qing Dynasty Empire enjoyed an unusually prosperous and peaceful 18th century, this dynasty went into a rather severe economic and societal decline during the 19th century, frequently suffering from both severe internal rebellions and external aggression. Many working-age Chinese at this time left their country, particularly from the southeastern maritime provinces of Guangdong and Fujian, especially when it comes to Montana, mostly from Guangdong. The map at the top of this slide uses the size of the blue circle in a given country to indicate the relative numbers of Chinese immigrants. The largest number, by far, of Chinese immigrants went to Southeast Asia. For example, Singapore, where Chinese form that city-state's largest ethnic group, even today, and have for many, many decades. These immigrants most often traveled by boat, often following the ancient sea trading routes you can see in the lower two slides, especially going through the Straits of Malacca, if they're going on to, say, Thailand and, or other places west of Singapore. Quite a lot came to the U.S. to work in places like the Hawaiian sugar cane plantations, one of the most famous being Sun Yat-sen, who was sort of a major founder of the Chinese Republic, was established right after the Qing dynasty was overthrown in 1911. That began in 1912. Push factors that sort of pushed Chinese to immigrate included overpopulation and a saturated local labor market, as suggested by the incredibly dense crowd you see on the left-hand side inside a railway station where people are just standing room only, just shoulder to shoulder, they're crowded together. Unemployment was particularly troubling in the Guangdong province after the First Sino-British War of 1839 to 1842, commonly known as the Opium War. In the aftermath of this war and the treaty settlement, the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, a lot of the local tea porters, like these men you see in the upper right-hand photograph, they were unable to find jobs. They were kicked out of the jobs because with the opening, according to the treaty rules, of new seaports that were closer to where most of the tea was produced, like in Shanghai and Ningbo, near the mouth of the Yangtze River, because that's where most of Chinese tea came from, that area, the lower Yangtze Valley. So Guangzhou tea trade really collapsed. So these are a whole lot of young men being thrown out of work. Taxes in Guangdong also rose quite a bit because the Qing Dynasty court in Beijing, they decided to force Guangdong province to pay the entire indemnity or war reparations to the British government that was included as part of the treaty settlement in 1842 at the end of the Opium War, the First Sino-British War. The major pull factors for immigration were the relatively higher wages available outside of China compared to inside of China, as well as an increasing demand for laborers in rapidly growing economies like that of Singapore. Laborers were urgently needed to do things like load and unload cargo ships and to haul goods between warehouses on shore. Both Chinese and foreign job recruiters, like the ones you can see in the upper left-hand drawing there, they would often be hanging around seaports like the dock areas of Shanghai and try to sign up workers to go overseas, to work at overseas sites. And oftentimes, part of the deal was that these contract laborers would have to work for, say, the first year or two without any salary, wages, to pay their ocean passage, because a lot of them didn't have enough savings to pay for the ocean trip, cross-ocean trip. Since Buddhism has, for many, many centuries, been the majority faith in China, Chinese immigrants would often intermarry with locals in mainland Southeast Asia and thus assimilate quite well into those countries. There are also a majority Buddhists, such as Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. In contrast, looking at the three sides below, those Chinese who are going to countries where Buddhism is in the minority or practically absent, or they mainly follow another religion such as Islam in Indonesia in the middle, or Catholicism in the left, oftentimes the Chinese would congregate in Chinatowns and not really mix as much into the population as they would in mainland Southeast Asia, or sometimes known as Indochina. Overseas Chinese economic success for these migrants, it would often be greater in places where they were either a majority of the population, as in Singapore. You can see that graph that's practically going off the top of the graph, income in Singapore, or where the Chinese were a very substantial minority, as in Malaysia, where Chinese amount to close to 30% of the population. Just, not very far behind the majority Malay ethnicity. In contrast, Southeast Asian countries where Chinese immigrants were a relatively small ethnic minority, such as Indonesia and the Philippines, overseas Chinese were most likely to become subject to some sort of discriminatory treatment and sometimes even violent pogroms. Fortunately, we don't seem to have encountered much in the way of violent pogroms against Chinese in Montana. However, in neighboring Wyoming, there was a notorious pogrom in a mining center, actually a coal mining center, Rock Springs, where almost 30 Chinese were killed, and their entire Chinatown was burned down. The 1840s international abolition of the Atlantic-based African slave trade resulted in labor shortages at plantations and mines in various places, especially in the Western Hemisphere. This stimulated increasing recruitment of coolies or manual laborers from China, India, and other places with labor surpluses. We can see a kind of barracks or boarding house in Sumatra for Chinese laborers working the tin mines, and then below we see a kind of construction, looks like some kind of a highway with some Chinese laborers working. Especially in the starting with the mid-19th century, many Chinese contract laborers were recruited to work in Sumatra's tin mines, Peru's silver mines, and sugarcane plantations in both Cuba and Hawaii. These contract laborers often had to forego their wages for the first year or two to pay for their ocean passage. In contrast, most of the Chinese immigrants who are coming to Montana are voluntary migrants, not contract laborers. They came to the mainland US and, of course, went to other places, and they paid their own ocean passage and looked for their own jobs, either individually or more often as a group of relatively young men from the same region with native place ties, often Guangdong So these were the workers who labored at placer gold mining, built railroads, and made other important contributions to the economy of Montana and the nation as a whole. But because of discriminatory U.S. immigration laws in the 19th century, it was very difficult for male Chinese immigrants to send for their wives back in China to come to the U.S. and join them. And U.S. Chinatowns, as a result, were mostly male until we had a major Immigration Reform Act in 1965. So you can get a sense, looking at this photo, mostly males in Chinatown at that time. Whereas nowadays, it looks a lot more normal, the gender balance. Okay, the U.S. Congress's Page Act of 1875 required that Chinese and other Asian women who applied for immigration to the U.S. prove that they were not prostitutes. In reality, women of all sorts of ancestry, and mainly Euro-Americans, worked in the sex trade in the U.S. West, including in places like Virginia City and Butte in Montana. So this law severely reduced the number of Chinese and other Asian women immigrants to the U.S. for decades to come, making Chinatowns mostly male until immigration laws were made much fairer in 1965. Turning back to Virginia City, near Montana, the labor intensity of placer gold mining that initially attracted so many Chinese to this area, starting from the mid-1860s, eventually grew kind of unprofitable as the mines were sort of played out. And only mechanical dredge mining was economically feasible by the 1890s. However, the Virginia City dredge companies typically hired only Euro-Americans or whites. This meant that the Chinese in Virginia City had to depend pretty much entirely on service industry jobs, such as shopkeeper, cook, launderer, household servant, that sort of thing. Some Chinese found better job prospects in large cities such as Butte. But even there in the 1890s, Chinese livelihoods were threatened by a local boycott of Chinese-run businesses such as laundries. Some Butte Chinese fought back by hiring a lawyer who successfully sued the anti-Chinese boycott organizers in court, thereby forcing them to call off the boycott. And some of the depictions we see, these are some of the folks in Butte who fought back and sued the organizers of the anti-Chinese business boycott. And some of the popular posters of the time, often somewhat in a caricature fashion, they caricatured Chinese as still all wearing a long queue or pigtail, whereas many of them have cut it off, and wearing the sort of Chinese outfit all the time. So relatively fair U.S. immigration laws did not appear until 1943, the Magnuson Act, and then especially 1965, the Immigration Reform Act. By that time, Virginia City's former Chinese residents had all either died or moved away. Formerly, one of the finest buildings in Virginia City was this two-story Chinese temple we see in this photo. It was a kind of a local landmark. All kinds of former residents recall the very lively sort of Chinese small orchestras and bands that would be striking up a tune from time to time, and especially during festivals, how this place would be the center of various types of celebrations, say the Lunar New Year. But by the 1930s, there weren't Chinese residents left in town who could push back against the local government society just to bulldoze the entire temple in order to straighten out a curve in the highway going through the town. So, essentially the Chinese, the Chinese community's major contribution to Montana from the state's beginning as a territory has mostly gone without recognition, except at the Maiwa Museum in Butte. Why couldn't Virginia City, which was formerly 1/3 Chinese in the 1860s, early 1870s, while the territorial capital, why couldn't they at least erect a plaque to memorialize this vanished community? There is a precedent along Interstate 80, east of Sacramento in California, a plaque in honor of the Chinese railway workers who were instrumental in building especially most of the western part of that intercontinental railroad. In conclusion, such a plaque in honor of Virginia City's ghost Chinese community could redress the notorious total omission of Chinese railway construction workers in this May 1869 photo commemorating the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in Promontory, Utah. There were actually a lot of Chinese workers who were outside of this photograph. None were allowed in, and so there are members of the Chinese American Committee who were arguing that in other celebrations of this, the anniversary of the completion of the railroad, they should have at least about half of the people in the posing picture should be Chinese. So, thank you for listening. That's my presentation. Just a couple of sources. In fact, the first author, Mark Johnston, is here today. So.